in some form or another. Are we not?
I'm asking you the questions, my friend.
Yes, I am you.
This happened about 10 years ago, in 2009. I was visiting my grandmother in a rural section of a lake of the Ozarks, near a small town with a hilarious name where I went to high school. I was very familiar with the area, and when visiting my grandmother, I would often walk into town, taking backwood trails until I reached the main road going into the town. Very rarely would someone stop and offer a ride, and normally I would accept. It's a small town in a rural area where everyone mostly knows everyone else, so I wouldn't even look up until I was getting into the vehicle. I stopped accepting rides after this. I had just come out of the woods and was walking along the side of the road. I was still maybe a mile or two out of town and enjoying my walk. An older blue Ford Taurus pulls up next to me. The driver rolls down the passenger window.
"Do you need a ride?"
I suddenly hear and start to walk over. I get in and get a good look at my driver. The man looked like a greasier version of Charles Manson. Flat, stringy brown hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in over a week coming down to his jawline. He had a salt and pepper 5 o'clock shadow and wild blue eyes. Something about him rang every alarm bell in my body, and I went to get back out of the car, but we were already in motion. Instead, I began to look around the vehicle. The front was pretty normal and even clean. The back seat is covered with a blanket. On top of the blanket is something that takes up nearly the entire back seat, wrapped in a tarp. Whatever it is, it stands to about 1.5 feet off the back seat. On top of all of this is a big black shaggy dog that is staring right through me.
"What are you doing here?"
The question snapped me back to the front seat. I'm sorry, what? I ask. He's now staring at me instead of the road.
"I said, what are you doing here?"
"Oh, I'm visiting my grandmother. I live in College Town about 90 miles from here, and I'm on my way to see some old friends." He frowns.
"No. Why are you here?"
I frown a little. Everything is flashing red flags right now. I just told you," I mumble. My tension is visibly rising. The dog gives a low growl from the back seat. We're now passing the sign for the country line. There's a gas station coming up that marks the beginning of the town. He is still staring at me.
"Why the fuck are you here?"
He screams out of nowhere, slamming his hands on the steering wheel. I'm now huddled against the door, shaking. He pulls into the gas station.
"Give me your glasses."
That was a statement, not a question, and there was no emotion in his voice. Without question, I hand them over.
"You better wait here."
He then goes into the store. I'm frozen in place, shaking and trying to will my arms and legs to work, trying to start breathing again. I know whatever the hell is going on, that I need out fast. The dog then gives another low growl, and that snapped me into action. I get up, almost rolling out of the car. I'm completely shaking, and I walk into the store and say to the guy, this is close enough to where I'm going. I would like my glasses now, please." My eyesight is very poor, but I could feel the intensity of the glare he gave me. I think the cashier could too, because she took a couple steps back, closer to the store phone. Silently, he hands my glasses to me and continues to stare daggers at me as I put them on. and then he walks out of the store without saying a word to either of us. The cashier stares at me, clearly freaked out. "What the fuck was that?" she asks me. The adrenaline of the situation had started to wear off, and the real gravity started to sink on me. Tears are now silently beginning to course down my face. Can I just use your phone, please?" I ask her. She nods and hands it to me with a box of tissues. She tells me I can go into the manager's office to make my phone call and to take as much time as I need. I thank her, go back, and let my friends know what just happened. I also tell them I will be cutting through the woods to get to them because I really don't want to see this guy ever again. I took a few minutes to breathe and relax after I hung up. When I went back out, the cashier asked if I was okay and if there was anything she could do for me. I thanked her again and told her no. I asked her if she knew the guy, and she said she has never seen him before and didn't think he was from the area. That literally shook me even more. I give her my friend's phone number and ask her to call them if he comes back. Then I left and cut through the woods to my friend's house. We had a great afternoon actually, and when I was ready to leave, they gave me a ride home. At the time, it didn't bother me as much, but the longer I've thought about it, the more curious I am about that back seat. It just looked as if someone was laying in a fetal position underneath that tarp. So first off, I'm going to tell you the story of what happened to me, and then I will explain the info that I found out later that revealed all the creepy stuff. This was in 2005, and I was living in Montana. I was 10 years old at the time. My 7-year-old sister and I shared a bed, and my best friend was also over this night having a sleepover. We were all in my big bed, which was up against a window. If you looked out the window, you would be at eye level with the ground. In front of you would just be the backyard, and to the left you would see the deck that went up the stairs and led to the kitchen. Anyways, this night was in February. The three of us were having a giggly sleepover in our bed, and I looked out the window for a split second and saw a deer on the deck. I showed my sister and my friend, and we didn't really think much of it. About an hour passed, and we were finally going to sleep. I looked out the window again and saw that the deer was still on the deck, but this time with 2 green lights looking up at us. I pointed it out to my sister and friend, and they saw it too. All of a sudden it moved, and it was very clear that it was not a deer. It was a person. We kept watching the person, and all of a sudden they started moving towards the deck stairs, which was towards us. He got to the bottom of the stairs and stopped. He was probably looking at us, and he just stood there for a few seconds. He was now about 6 feet away from our window. It really freaked us out, and we all started screaming, and he clearly heard us and ran out of the backyard. My dad immediately went outside with his gun, called the cops, but they found nothing. So that was the experience, but here's the context. I didn't know this because I was young, and my parents didn't say anything. But during this time, all of the neighbors got a notice from the local PD saying that they had information leading them to believe a wanted killer was in the neighborhood, or at least in the area, and to keep an eye out. They later released the name of this individual to be Joseph Duncan. It was the talk of the town, that's for sure. Of course, my parents did not tell us any of this. About a month and a half later, in Idaho, a little girl named Shasta and her brother Dylan were kidnapped, and the entire family inside the house was killed with a hammer by, you guessed it, a man named Joseph E. Duncan. What is crazy is he snuck into their home in the middle of the night after scouting out their home once or twice. He could have very well done the same thing to my family that night, or possibly another night. He did horrible and unspeakable things to the children and eventually killed the little boy. He tortured that poor little girl until they were found in a Denny's. Now my family was all over this because we believe that man was at our house that night. Here's one more kicker. He used night vision goggles to scope out houses of his potential victims. So those green little lights I saw in the deer, I'm pretty sure that was the reflection of the night vision goggles, and I am totally convinced. Back in the 1980s, I worked in law enforcement. I have never encountered such a demented psychopath in my entire life. It was July 1986, and I had to listen to Bob's confessions. I cannot legally give out his name, even though he was executed, but he did some really awful things that I could never really get out of my head. Our police force was in a small town that we will call Meadowbrook. I was raised there. My wife and I were also raising our 2 kids there. We lived in an old whitewashed farmhouse that I had inherited from my parents. It was just your typical small backwoods country town. Anyway, my partner had called me into work really late in the evening to try to get this guy to confess. He was a tall, chubby guy with a baby face. My partner actually bought him McDonald's because he was not going to talk until he got something to eat. We had to bribe him. Well, the Big Mac did the trick, I guess. Bob's fingernails were very dirty, and his teeth were a bit yellowed, probably from smoking. He wore a white t-shirt and a pair of old blue jeans. Bob then told us he was in and out of foster homes since he was a teen. His mother always called him the bad child, and she used to beat him with a yardstick. His brothers and sisters were favored over him, and he never seemed to get the affection he craved. When Bob would get teased by his siblings, he would cry and they would laugh at him. He tried to strangle his little sister when he was 10. Bob was laughing as he told us this, and that she actually passed out for a moment. At 16, Bob got a girl pregnant and she had a miscarriage. Bob said it was because he got drunk and he punched her in the stomach. He was very abusive to her. The sickest thing ever is that Bob kept the miscarriage and told her not to flush it. He got it out of the toilet and told her they would bury the baby together. Bob then told me how he kept it for himself and then dissected it up in his room because he wanted to see what humans' insides looked like. He kept it in a box for a few weeks and it began to stink, so he flushed it. He didn't want his parents to find out. Bob then told me as he got older, he had a craving to kill someone. He wanted to know what it was like to experience the death of someone by his own hands. He said the thoughts were invasive, and it made him feel powerful. This is where the demented part comes in. Bob was now in his 20s and went out to meet some friends at a local bar. They were all drinking and playing pool for quite a few hours. One of his friends had been talking about Bob behind his back. He was saying nasty things about Bob, about how he was weird and how they should all stop hanging out with him. Well, Bob found out about it, so Bob devised a little plan. Bob made sure not to drink too much. He had planned to get the friend really drunk and bought him extra drinks throughout the night. Later on, he asked if he could drive his poor drunk friend home. On the way home, they stopped at the railroad tracks and threw the glass beer bottles at the tracks. Bob then pulled out a gun and made the friend get on his knees. He asked him why he was talking bad about him and what did he ever do to deserve such a slap in the face. Bob's friend then told him to go fuck himself, and that's when Bob did it. He shot him once in the arm. Blood began pouring out of the wound. The friend was in shock and tried to run away, so Bob jumped on top of him and began choking him. His friend then passed out, and when he came to, Bob made him put the gun in his mouth and began yelling at him, "You're going to kill yourself tonight, and I'm going to watch." The friend began crying and begging for mercy. Bob was very excited and animated when telling me the story, and I just sat there wondering how any human could do such a horrible thing and be happy about it. That's when Bob began rubbing his friend's blood all over his lips and face, tasting it. He began to stick his finger in the bullet hole and he started moving it around. It was pure torture. His friend began screaming in pain. He then shot him again, this time in the leg. Bob confessed he choked him out once more. He hogtied this poor unconscious man's arms and legs with rope he had gotten out of his trunk. His friend didn't weigh very much. He was a small guy in stature, so Bob picked him up and shoved him in his blue 1980 Chrysler New Yorker. It was all too easy for Bob. He drove around smoking a cigarette and heard his friend moaning in the back. He drove up a long muddy driveway which led to a local mill where Bob worked part-time. Bob opened the trunk. It was a desolate area, not a soul around. Bob hoisted him up and made him walk moaning in pain all the way to the huge wood chipper with blood dripping down his leg. Keep in mind, in the 80s, old farm equipment had no safeguards. He laid his body down and started up the wood chipper engine. "Please don't do this," begged his friend who was beginning to look really pale and began gurgling blood. Bob didn't care. He told me this only excited him more. He shoved him in feet first. The machine showed no mercy and sucked his almost lifeless body right in. He told me how he watched his friend's last moments. The poor skinny guy's face looked contorted as he tried to grab with all of his might to pull himself out. Bob told me how he heard the loud grinding popping noise of the wood chipper and how he enjoyed the smell of fresh death as his friend was being grounded up in the machine. He could hear bones cracking and muffled screams as his friend's body was being ripped to shreds. His remains sprayed up into the air with bits of bloody wood in little fragments. It was all over so very quick. Bob just stared in awe. It was the most gruesome thing he had ever seen. This sick man was aroused by the whole act of brutally murdering an innocent man, and Bob seemed to be pleased with himself. Sadly, I had to view the awful crime, and that was not pretty. I think those images will haunt me till the day I die. You see, when someone dies in a wood chipper accident, it's a bloody pulpy mess full of teeth, hair, and nail fragments to collect for evidence. You have to be careful to pick up the bone shards and not to cut yourself. It can smell really bad days after finding such remains. I really felt sorry for whoever had to clean the rest of that machine out. What happened to Bob? He got the electric chair many years ago. I was happy because he couldn't hurt anyone else. He had no feelings of guilt or remorse. I felt sorry for the poor family who lost their son. I wish there wasn't so many crazy people in the world capable of such horrid things. I have kept a lot of terrible stories to myself that I have witnessed over the years. Some of them I have had therapy for. When people are murdered, you don't always hear a full in-depth confession of what exactly happened. Sometimes you get the bits and pieces and enough to accuse them of it. Sometimes, things are kept from being public. I am happily retired now. My kids are grown, and I'm now watching my grandkids grow. My wife and I still live in the same whitewashed farmhouse. Life is good.